Harlem Renaissance. Very interestingly, you might have seen that the topics here before we have now immediately not come to war. All right, we are going to look at war a little later, because after this is what we're going to look at war poets. This is Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance is the kind of period where we see a coming up of African American culture. All right, you might have seen one of those very famous recently, an African singer, jazz singer's song, which became so famous in all the popular social medias. All right, so that is what we are doing here. We are seeing the coming up of jazz music, especially dominated by African Americans. Like you might have observed the coming up of the instrument Congo. Okay, Congo as an instrument is actually an African instrument which found its space into American music houses as well. All right, so we are looking at the coming up of African American cultural literature heritage. So you see it in music, art, literature, politics, and social movements. Okay, so this is the point. They are all African Americans. Mind you, this is not African literature. All right, they're all African American literature. Maybe you can look at it, or African American popular literature, African American literature of the 20th century. All right, so you see that exactly the point that I was talking about, an exodus, an evacuation of many Blacks from south to the northern cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. For that particular point, you can also understand American was also transitioning into its industrial, revolution period. So you see a lot of transition from the south of America to the north of America. So, maybe moving from an agrarian economy to a more industrialized, economy. And then you also see that, tens of thousands from the rural south to the northern cities. You see a lot of move, all in pretext of employment, in pretext of security, in pretext of wages. Rather, they made a move from the south of America to the north of America, and this was the new Negro movement. So exactly like you see at this particular point, a lot of writers, poets, artists, musicians, intellectuals, all these express about their race and about their culture. One very, again, let us not just get confused with it into African, kind of, a writing. But this is a kind of a writing which takes pride in their indigenous literature, which came into expression because of this Harlem Renaissance. Let me just mark you this about it. All these literature originated from a place by name Harlem. All right, so Harlem is a place in American subcontinent, that is a place where, African American literature, cultural heritage actually flourished. And when we talk about Renaissance, what is Renaissance? Renaissance is anytime a period of cultural upheaval, or let's say intellectual, cultural, literary upheaval. That's the point I made. That's why we use the terminology by name Harlem Renaissance. All right, so Renaissance, exactly like how we talk about Renaissance, our English literature, where we find that Renaissance is a kind of a kind of a cultural and literary upheaval that in African Americans in America. That's what you're observing here. Okay, so some of these, Harlem Renaissance artists, one being Archibald J. Motley. So, his 1929 painting Blues shows African Americans enjoying dance and music. People, you might have observed today, many of those wall pictures today, maybe wallpapers, what you call it, have a picture of that African women, right? Which has become very famous today in wallpapers, right? Exact. And then you observe them having something known as a mridangam, maybe an Indian instrument kind of a thing, okay? And holding them, enjoying dance and music. How is it that today suddenly we have African women being portrayed in art, right? So that's a major transition. So that's it. You see African Americans enjoying culture was partly an attempt to break down stereotypes of African Americans as less refined. Very, very, very important concept. We think that, that's what I told you recently, the song of this African American, which became very famous, was it's only to break down the fact that, that they are very less trained. They don't have a cultural appetite. They don't have a lit appetite. All that was foiled by the coming of the outlook of, this African American, Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston's novels are still of pursuit today. So we could talk about how, it is who arrived in Harlem with 1.55. As much as we talk about cultural heritage, how can we forget? We also talk about the writing, which emerged at this particular point. So this is the kind of a challenge in its very title, the new Negro. So the new Negro is not the submissive Negro looking for a kind of renunciation. We find the Negro quite self-sufficient in their own indigenous culture, pride in their own indigenous culture, which is being brought to expression. So this is the kind of writing which originated in America. Diasporic writings, all right. For example, many people say that even Maya Angelou, one of the most very prominent African writer, many people say that even she was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but then she wrote from a more diasporic edge. All right. So these African Americans, they perhaps, corrupted, corrupted their culture also. They would just took a pride in their grand culture, and that was what showcased in their writings. All right. So that, and you can clearly observe magazines which propagated this thought, and one was the crisis, which was published by the National Association. We are just bringing up to the mainstream the literature of the blacks, or maybe the Negro literature as they call it. The Negro World, the newspaper of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association also played a role, but few of the major authors or artists identified with Garvey's Back to Africa movement, even if they contributed to the paper. This ideology, what exists here is, they're not just celebrating their own culture and their own literature, but maybe they also possess a diasporic edge to get back to their own country. So maybe if you tell me, like, how do we place, so is it possible that some of our diasporic writers are also a part of the Harlem Renaissance? We need to judge the writing. All right. So only the writing will be able to tell you whether it's a part of Harlem Renaissance, whether it's a diasporic writing, whether it's a part of in the African indigenous literature, whether it's a part of the colonizer writes back. Is it that kind of a writing? All this we would understand only when we read the writing, not the writer. All right. So right. So that's the point here. Even though when they portray their culture, it is not that they're trying to establish the supremacy of the Black literature or the Negro literature, but the purpose here was to perhaps develop that kind of a link in order to get back to their roots. All right. And also this might be a reason why this kind of a literature is coming up, is also because you're trying to preserve the roots. For example, today you might have seen a lot of music, like for example there is this one platform by name Sacred Chants, okay, which exists today. So what are they doing? They're trying to a reform talking about the. All right, I was actually trying to look at as to how Harlem Renaissance got its expression in the form of magazines. Here it being the Crisis, here it being the magazines by name Opportunity, here it also being the magazine by name The Messenger. All these magazines which came about, and the other newspaper which being the Negro World, it was only to sense that kind of literature which existed with respect to the African culture. Now, one kind of what I was actually harping about a very large period was the fact that these writings in some way might be taken for the fact that are they So it's raining here, so I guess that is the reason why there is a network disruption. All right, fine. At this particular point, yeah, I was again looking at the kind of this is the third time I'm repeating this. Anyway, we're looking at the kind of magazines which came about, one being the crisis, the second being the opportunity, the third being the messenger, fourth being the Negro world. What did they do? They tried to emancipate, or let's say empower the Negroes, or let's say the black writings which originated at that particular point. What I was trying to put as a disclaimer before we ventured ahead was that let us not understand that whether all these writings had a diasporic edge. No, but I would want you to look at the writing before you judge it. Sometimes the writers over time have written in a more diasporic way. See, sometimes these writings can be looked at as a diasporic writing. These could be looked at as African writing. These could be looked as indigenous literature and its style of writing. But here we are primarily trying to focus on the kind of writings which celebrated the indigenous kind of writings which existed with respect to Africa. All right, so that was the point that we are trying to focus on here. And and you might have observed that I've clearly mentioned this Back to Africa movement. This Back to Africa is, how this Harlem Renaissance celebration of the African culture took a diasporic edge over time. And there's one more thing which I wanted to say, like how I was proceeding. Many of these, this Renaissance was a celebration to the coming of jazz, to the coming of Congo music. Well, I wanted to tell you about it. Everybody might have heard the music Lambada. All right, the Lambada music is also a consequence of the Harlem Renaissance. The Lambada music is so prominent today. The Congos and the music is so prominent today. All this is consequential of the kind of what do you say, a cultural upheaval which was a consequence of the Harlem Renaissance.